Okay, we're going to get started. My name is Robert Hughes, and I'm with the Open University of the Left, an organization that is now in its, well, we're concluding our 26th year, and hopefully there'll be some more going forward. Anyway, we are going into hibernation next month, and at the moment we aren't even sure about doing something for February. Like everyone else, we're still waiting for winter to really begin here. God only knows, and that is a problem, of course, at this time of year. On that same note, we are always looking for presenters to do programming at OUL. So if you or anyone you know has any ideas on that subject, please give us a heads up, and we'll see what we can do with that. Now for today's event, we want to welcome back Dr. Anthony DiMaggio, has taken the time to drive up here from Springfield today. Thank God the weather's not been bad, in order to make his presentation. And I'm going to say we are going to pass the hat later on so that we can hopefully cover Tony's gas expenses up here. Tony earned his PhD in political science from the University of Illinois here in Chicago. He is the author of at least 5 books. I believe this is his 5th presentation online since we've gotten a YouTube site, going back about 5 years now. But before that, I think his first time here was back in '07, so that would make for probably, this is his 7th appearance here in 7 years. He's the author of at least 5 books. He has also written for numerous online and print publications. Those would be what you might know. Counterpunch comes to mind right away, a regular there. Also has written in the past on ZNet and Monthly Review. Those are just a few that come to mind. Today his presentation, the title is The Higher Education Ponzi Scheme. In this he will be discussing the growing problems found in higher education in the United States. Some ideas discussed include the rapidly declining state of higher education brought on in part by the abandonment of teaching itself as a priority, the overemphasis on meaningless and esoteric research at the expense of academic research that would have, in the case of the public, real societal value, the growing and unsustainable cost of higher education, this is another point, which includes the sorry state of higher education employment, and the decline of faculty job security. Tony has experienced these problems and the problems that affect higher education from a first-hand perspective over the last decade. He has been teaching or has taught at liberal arts colleges, major state universities, and at the community college level. So his...
Can't hold a job.
Held many jobs, that's the problem.
Yeah, that's the problem, many jobs. But that is just to make the point that, you know, this is an individual that can really address this subject in a thorough fashion. Okay, so rather than just sitting here talking more and more, let's just welcome Tony. Take it over.
Well, thank everybody for coming out. The title of the presentation I come up with originally was based on an article I wrote from Counterpunch. This idea of a Ponzi scheme, but I was thinking about it, and I thought, well, what's a Ponzi scheme? You've got usually an individual who is manipulating consumers and investors, promising them massive returns off of some sort of investment, and they don't deliver on them. And I thought, well, is it a Ponzi scheme, or is it more like a pyramid scheme? So with a pyramid scheme, you've got a very few at top, not just one. And then it sort of goes down from there, right? Obviously, a pyramid, we know how that works. And then there's a vast majority of people at the bottom of this process who, I'm going to argue, are not getting their money's worth out of this process. They are being ripped off in the modern age, and there's 5 reasons that I've been able to identify in my 10 years teaching in higher education. Now, I should be clear, the difference between what I'm calling for here is, when you look at what I'm arguing, if you look at conservative thought in America, oftentimes there's this idea that, well, higher education is full of these liberal boobs, and, you know, get rid of these people and they're corrupting America, and tear it all down and gut it and sell it off, right? University of Phoenix can stay around, and Harvard. You know, you can make money off of it, or education can serve the elites. And that's not what I'm calling for. I'm calling for tearing it down and rebuilding it with public values. And that's something that really has disappeared in the last few decades. It's really unfortunate. A lot of people don't realize it because most parents don't really follow this stuff closely. There's 5 things I'm going to talk about. One is this whole shift in the, I guess you could call it the neoliberal era. You've got a shift where teachers widely now, and administrators, and even students and parents look at students as consumers, not as like citizens trying to actually learn something and become better citizens and better people. Now, in any educational system that functions well, obviously both of those things need to happen. People need to learn skills to do something in society and have a career, but also they need to learn to care about things and develop critical thought. And we've really seen sort of the neglect of that citizen component. The second thing I'm going to talk about is cost. There's this massive growth in cost in the last 2 or 3 decades. It's really not sustainable in any way. What else? Abandonment of teaching. Now, people still teach, right? But the difference between today and 30 years ago is that teaching was the primary component of assessing a professor for most people who taught at state universities and colleges. And that's really disappeared in recent decades. The rise of meaningless research agendas has replaced teaching. Now, there's always been massive amounts of research, for lack of a better word, I would term crap. Just stuff that gets produced because somebody thinks to produce it, but it has no real significant value or practical value. That's always been there, but it's become more extreme when you neglect teaching. So that's a 4th thing, the rise of sort of meaningless research. And finally, just a general assault on teachers. That's going to be the 5th point. So all of these things I'm going to cover in some detail. There are some winners in the scheme. When you talk about a pyramid scheme, and there are losers. Who are the winners at the very top of this process? College administrators have made out like bandits. Massive increases in salaries and pay and support staff. That's where most of the resources for colleges and universities have gone in recent decades. When you talk about pay of actual employees for the university or college. Elite students. It might cost $60,000 or $70,000 or more to go to an Ivy League school, but if you're a wealthy family, you can afford that, right? So you're going to be a winner in this process. You'll get an elite degree and you'll get an elite job, and the system will suit you fine, the way it is. Elite professors will do fine, people who went to elite schools and get elite jobs at elite universities. And rich people in general will do really well, because if we stop funding education, then they don't have to pay taxes for the idea of a public education. So these are the winners. It's going to be a relatively small number of people. The losers will be the typical college student who graduates with massive amounts of debt. The typical college professor who really doesn't get paid much of anything anymore. And the average family that has to borrow massive amounts of money and cash in retirement to pay for higher education. So the first big problem I want to talk about with students as consumers, this is really a big thing. At some point in recent decades, there was this idea that got developed, and people who go around the country nationally and talk on the education talk circuit, different administrators and people who write books and business people, they came up with this idea that higher education should be a private good, not a public good. And that was really the beginning of the end, because if higher education is a private good, then why do we have to fund it through tax dollars? Why don't we just get rid of it? Why don't we cut the funding year after year? And who will pay for it? Well, you just jack up tuition rates. So there's been a wholesale abandonment of this idea of education as a public good. Just this last year, the school that I teach at in Springfield saw a 30% cut in state funding. And now we've been told from the incoming Rauner administration, which by the way promised to manage the broken budget, but also come up with more money for tuition costs and helping students. We've heard from them, expect another 30% cut in state funding. So you've got these exorbitant tuition rates already today. They're going to be exacerbated even further. Most public universities today are almost public in name only. They still get some money from the state, but the amount's been cut down so much over recent decades that they're almost like quasi-privatized entities. A lot of people don't realize that. You see a name like Illinois State University or University of Illinois, and they think it's a public university. It is in some ways because they get a little bit of state funding, but most of it does not come from the state. The Rauner administration said that he said he was going to come up with more revenues to deal with the growing problem of tuition hikes, and now we're seeing this idea of a 30% cut being floated. So that's not the first time somebody's lied in a campaign, obviously, but this is a big problem, of course, too. If you look at this state, interestingly enough, there was an advisory ballot initiative just this November. And they asked people if we should tax millionaires more to pay for public education in the state. And by more than 2 to 1, Illinois citizens said, yes, we should do that. And then they voted for a billionaire who wants to cut taxes on people who are wealthy and cut education spending. Sounds a little strange, right? How do you vote for the exact opposite of what you said you wanted? So what's going on there? How is that even possible? Well, obviously there's a disconnect, right? You've got a disconnect between what people say they want and what they actually are voting for. You only get that in a society when people are not being educated properly to A, care about politics and pay attention, and B, critically analyze what political leaders are saying versus what they're doing. And anybody who was paying attention closely knew that the math didn't add up on what he was proposing. He's proposing more spending for pensions and education, but cutting taxes. It made no sense. And you could have figured it out pretty easily if people had a basic sort of critical literacy and civic literacy. So there's this disconnect out there, and a lot of that I believe pretty firmly traces back to this process in higher ed where a lot of teachers I talk to today and administrators, they're convinced that education is first and foremost about vocation. You go to get a degree so that you can get a job. And you don't have to worry about, well, why do we need a U.S. government requirement? You don't need that. The whole state of Illinois got rid of it in the last 10 years. Almost every school in the state has gotten rid of a general education requirement that you know about American government and politics. Well, because people don't need to know about that, right? You just need a degree. And then people don't know how to think. We wonder if these things are connected. Well, obviously they are. You have a governor like Bruce Rauner who can get elected because he buys an election and radically outspends his competitor. And people will vote for something that's the opposite of what they want because they see nice, shiny ads and they get a good impression of him and they hear him saying that we want to shake up Springfield. He will shake it up, but it'll be in a way that opposite of what people actually want. So we've got this problem in America where people are, I guess to put it bluntly, they're culturally backward. People don't have enough critical consciousness, and you get that when you treat students as private consumers in a marketplace. They won't become active citizens. They will be very infantile in their thinking. And if you change higher ed from a public good to a private one, you see this huge growth in cost. This is the second big thing I wanted to talk about. From 1978 to 2011, the cost of higher education in this country went up almost 250% after inflation. I've seen other numbers that look for about 3 decades or more, and they say it about tripled. So whether you say 250 or 300% or whatever it is, you've had a radical increase. Just to give you an example, I went to Illinois State University back in 2002 for my undergraduate degree. You could go total cost for food, housing, books, tuition, anything else for about $13,000. And today it's about $25,000. Just a little bit more than a decade later, it's gone up almost 100%. During that same time, there were a bunch of things that were going on, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But just to give you some context here, this is an interesting statistic. If you were the average student trying to go to a 4-year school in 1980, and you earned the minimum wage, you could pay for an entire year of tuition at a 4-year school in 6.5 weeks of work. You could work half of a summer and have enough money to pay your tuition. Today, you would have to work half of a year to pay tuition. Part of that's a function of a minimum wage being lower today than it used to be, and a lot of it's a function of this radical growth in cost of tuition. So there's a bunch of reasons why cost has gone up. State funding cuts is a big one I mentioned. Massive growth in administrative bloat. You've got this massive growth in administrators and support staff, which have really taken the lion's share of pay and additional pay and pay raises and basically the resources of schools for the last few decades. Also, there's been a huge amenities explosion. A lot of schools have spent millions of dollars totally renovating campuses and dorms and facilities and building new rec centers, and all that sounds really nice until you realize you have to pay twice as much to go to a school. And it's very different than let's say, a community college model, which to this day, by law, those schools have to make education affordable to community members. So you can forget about the amenities explosion. You're not allowed to do it. These four-year schools have been allowed to do it if you abandon a public obligation for those schools. As far as I can tell, community colleges are really the last place in America today that actually is a public institution for higher education. Administrative salaries have also skyrocketed. Just to give you an idea, going back to Illinois State University, that entire campus and town was renovated with tens of millions of dollars that was raised in the early 2000s. You can't even recognize the town and school. Most of the buildings got renovated, the dorms got torn down and renovated, new ones got built, new rec centers, new everything, really, which is nice. But at the expense of not being able to afford to go? Well, it's all nice, but what does that matter if you can't afford it? Just to give you a little bit of a taste of my experiences. So I was 22, this was back in 2002. We lived in a dorm that was, by modern standards, you would think that we were being repressed or something with how college campuses look today. No air conditioning. I said, oh, we need air conditioning? Well, it's 2 or 3 months out of the year when it's hot. Just deal with it. Dial-up internet, building that was 60, 70 years old, hadn't been renovated in half a century, and people just dealt with it. It was the idea that, well, it wasn't a nice facility, but we're not here to eat caviar and drive around in Cadillacs and you know, put on the credit card a bunch of things that as students we're not going to be able to afford. We're going to borrow a bunch of money and mortgage our future away. That wasn't the idea. Yes, it wasn't the nicest place, but you're a student living in a college dorm. Where do you want to live, in a Hilton day spa? I mean, I'm not against making buildings nice, but this was being done at the same time that funding was being cut for the university. You're raising tens of millions of dollars going to administrative salaries and amenities explosions, and you're cutting funding for the school, and tuition is going up. The money could have been spent a lot better. It should have been reprioritized. So to give you an example today, just to sort of flesh this out. If you go to school for an average of 5 years, and most students are even going to school now for more than 5 years. If you are borrowing $25,000 a year or spending that, that's $125,000. Whereas you could have gotten that same degree 10 years ago for around $50,000. Or if you actually went for 5 years, it would be a little bit more, but you know, if you were actually a diligent student and got done in 4 years, you could get done in less than $50,000. If you did what I did and went to a community college first, you could graduate with even half of that, because you wouldn't have to borrow money for your first 2 years. Now, if you have 2 children today and you're thinking about sending them to college, that's $250,000. That's $250,000 in this market for children who are going to graduate and probably start in a job that pays them like $40,000 or less, maybe. Or maybe they can't find a job. Maybe less than that. Maybe they don't find any job. There was a joke when I was in school too, and a lot of people, maybe parents don't think about this, but if you do 4 years of school, you can do 5 classes a semester and be done in 4 years. Why is the average kid taking 5 years? Well, the joke was that your minor was keg stands. Your 5th class was partying. You didn't do a 5th class, you did 4. The 5th class was drinking. So there's that too to consider. I mean, there's been a lot of talk among students about the idea of a college experience. Well, everybody wants to have an experience, and that's nice, but is it worth mortgaging your future away to drink for an extra year and to pay $125,000 for a degree? The average student today owes $30,000 in student loan debt. The average parents take out another $15,000. That's almost $50,000. Now, if the average student is paying $125,000 for 4 years, that means there's another $80,000 coming out of parents' savings and earnings. So they're literally mortgaging away potential retirement money to fund this extremely bloated, underfunded system. So that's a really big problem that really hasn't been dealt with today. A lot of parents, I was talking to a parent recently, He's a guy I've known for a long time. He's a nice guy, and his daughter graduated high school. He was sending her off to a state university in Illinois. And I asked him, I said, you know, have you looked at the tuition rates and how much they've gone up in the last 10 years? He said, I have no idea. She's just going to go away. I didn't even look at it. So you're committing to $125,000 over 5 years without having even thought about the implications of that. And a lot of parents do it. They think, well, it's your kid's future. You can't skimp on that, right? Well, there's different ways that we could be structuring education where people don't have to give away their retirement to do it. But that really hasn't happened. Another big thing is, a third thing I wanted to talk about, abandoning teaching. Now, people still teach, obviously. You go to the average state university or college, and of course they're still teaching, but when I say abandoning teaching, I mean in terms of a priority. Universities and colleges across the country have systematically moved away, and I can say this from my own personal experience. In the last 10 years, they've moved away from prioritizing education and quality of teaching in terms of hiring. Now, that doesn't mean that every school does it. There are plenty of community colleges and four-year schools that do prioritize teaching, a lot of liberal arts colleges that still do that. And there still are a lot of teachers who want to be good teachers and spend a lot of time on it. So we're talking in generalities here. But generally speaking, from most of my experiences, most administrators don't care much about teaching quality. Some schools care, most don't. When you look at the list of priorities for hiring a new professor, the top of the list is, what school did you go to? Did you go to Harvard, University of Chicago? That's going to put you at the top of the list. Most people who go to elite schools actually don't have much teaching experience. Now, actually, that's the case across the board, too, though. Most grad students don't, coming out of college, have a lot of teaching experience, and the simple reason why is because it's not prioritized in graduate school. The professors who teach this stuff, they don't stress it. The idea is, and I've been told this by numerous people on committees and searches going across this country for different political science jobs and new hiring. They've said, no, we want to look at your research and see how good it is. We assume that you'll be a good teacher. That's not even really a big priority. Number one is prestige of your degree. Number two is prestige of your publications, if you have any. Now, most people don't when they graduate, so you're sort of banking on the fact that they came from a prestigious school and assuming they're going to produce prestigious publications. Teaching is at the bottom of the list. I've seen this numerous times. Every school claims to care about teaching, but if nobody actually does, the beauty of the scheme is, how will people know if you have a bad teacher? Or how will people know if you have a good teacher? How would you know if you have a good teacher if you've never seen one? It becomes very easy to see classroom after classroom of bad teaching, mediocre teaching, and forget what good teaching looks like until you actually see it in a rare instance. This is the irony. 75 to 80% or more of your time as a teacher at a typical university or college is going to go into teaching classes, because you have to teach 3 classes a semester or 4. And you're teaching people not to really prioritize that. So what ends up happening is teachers end up taking shortcuts. It's not uncommon today to see ambitious professors who get hired at a state university to have 5 or 10 working papers at once while they're supposed to be teaching 3 classes. I don't care if you're teaching no classes. I don't know how you do 10 research projects at once. Add teaching to it. There's no way that you're going to be able to commit time to good teaching, period. You're not going to be able to do that if you're focusing a huge amount of your time on research. Now, the idea in previous decades was you were a teacher first and foremost. You got tenure based on teaching. Most people didn't have high prestige publications if you go back a few decades. Now, some people did and most people didn't. It's not that it was discouraged, it was an important thing. It's just that teaching was prioritized a lot more. That was the big difference. It's a relative change. So what happens today? Well, we know that things like grade inflation are rampant. You give students high grades, they don't complain. Maybe the teaching quality isn't that good. Maybe most people can't even recognize the difference between a good teacher and a bad one. And as long as they get good grades, then what's the point? You're getting a training for a degree, right? You're going to go out on the marketplace, and that's what you're there for. We've got grade inflation today in colleges and universities. From the most recent statistics I've seen, 10% of students get D's and F's or withdraw from classes. 90% get an A, a B, or a C. The average grade in Ivy League schools is like an A to an A minus. Well, what's the point of having an average grade if the average is an A? An average by definition is average, not excellent. You've had a systematic inflation of grades in this agreement, this sort of quiet agreement between students and teachers in the neoliberal era. The students understand, well, the class is easy and I may be paying a premium for this, but at least I'm not going to get less than a B or an A most of the time in my classes and I can go get my degree. And the agreement from the teacher is, well, leave me alone, damn it. I can go do my research and you got your A or B. And no one's going to say this. That's the interesting thing. You go look at schools throughout this state and every other state, they will always tell you, we value teaching so much. We care so much. But nobody hires based on that. Most departments don't do that. And I, from my own experience, just to give you one example, I went to the University of Illinois, Chicago. At risk of outing my school that granted me my PhD, I'm going to do that. I talked to a professor at the beginning of my time there as a PhD student. He looked at me flat in the face and said, there's never been a teacher who's been denied tenure here for bad teaching. I've never seen it in more than 3 to 4 decades. It's never happened. Now that's supposedly a research-based school. Other state universities I've had experiences with and teachers I've talked to have said things not quite as extreme. They say things like, well, as long as you're not a bad teacher, you'll get tenure. So that's your bar. As long as you don't get awful reviews, you'll get tenure. You could be an average teacher, maybe even slightly below average. Forget about being a good teacher or an excellent teacher. That's not rewarded. And these are teaching-based schools, people say this. It's really quite fascinating. Grad schools don't prioritize teaching people the importance of teaching. That's a big change. It's grown a lot more extreme over time. Point 4, pointless research. Pointless. I'm not talking about research that has practical implications about how does power get exercised in the real world, what's the relationship between inequality and our democracy, does democracy decline, does it become far weaker with growing inequality? There's all types of questions like that are interesting questions with practical value. What can people do to make society more democratic? There's all types of questions that could be asked. Very rarely are they asked. Most of the time people do very esoteric research with little practical value. I've been told by numerous people, colleagues of mine, that they want to stay away from big issues. Why? Because if you try and make a grand argument with big points, you're sticking your neck out and you can get attacked. What if other people actually notice you did research and they attack it and you get discredited? Well, the idea with science and knowledge is supposed to be, whether you're right or wrong, you try and answer big, grand questions with practical value. And even if you're wrong, you move the discussion forward. That's how science and knowledge progress, and people have really abandoned that to a large extent. The idea now is, and I've been told this by people as well, well, if the language is abstract and hard to understand, that makes it better. If the research project is about statistics, it becomes a glorified statistical analysis and not even about politics or the world in the case of social science, all the better. You have a whole cottage industry of teachers now, they call them methodologists. Their whole career is based on statistics and the quality of a research design. They do research design. The whole paper, the whole project is about how great their ability to measure things is. It doesn't even have anything to do with actual politics. People became applied statisticians, in other words. That's what happened in the social sciences, and particularly in political science, in the last few decades. The harder it is to understand, the better. The fewer people understand it, the smarter you are. It's a big pissing contest. And most people don't even understand what it is they're reading in these high-level academic journals today. You've got these journals like American Political Science Review and American Journal of Political Science. No one reads them across the country, but it's prestigious. So an administrator can give you tenure because you publish there, but on average, I look through these journals every year. About 90 to 95% of the stuff is stuff you look at it and you'd say, why the hell did someone even ask this question? I can't even think of a practical value for what you did. Well, it's because they're not doing it based on practical value. The idea is, well, it's a prestigious publication, and whether anyone reads it or not, it's recognized by the institution as being prestigious. You can bring people in to these new jobs, and they have prestigious degrees from prestigious schools, and they publish in prestigious journals, and the facade of rigor is what matters. The appearance of rigor, not actual knowledge of politics or quality of teaching. You produce a book. The book doesn't even have to be a paperback today. Most of the time they're not. You sell it to a library. 300 libraries buy it for $100 each. Nobody reads it. That's what happens in a lot of these publishers. They have not even, well, a lot of these publishers have even given up on trying to market paperbacks. We're going to make 300 copies to libraries. That's going to net us $25,000 to $30,000 or more. That's enough for the typical book. Move on. The professor gets tenure. Nobody reads it. It sits on a library shelf. And I'm not going to criticize libraries. My wife's a librarian, and libraries are wonderful. But if it's just going to sit on a shelf and no one's going to read it, then you have a problem there. But people don't seem to think so today. You've got institutions and professors with tremendous resources in terms of the money going into these schools. And they're engaged oftentimes in little more than intellectual masturbation. It's something that makes them feel good personally, and it does nothing for anyone else. It really is a good metaphor. Why do people do this? Because you get co-opted. You can call yourself a university professor, you get tenure, you have a PhD, and to put it perfectly bluntly, this isn't going to win me any awards among faculty across the country. People are cowards. If I say something that challenges the status quo and I become a public intellectual, then negative attention might be drawn to me or the school. What if I say something so controversial that people call for me to get fired? You want to be the Ward Churchill of the modern era? Someone who writes an essay after 9/11 about how Americans in some ways invited the 9/11 attacks on ourselves, and then you get fired from your job. Regardless of what people thought about what he said, you're supposed to have academic freedom, right? But it's not for everybody. If you say something that's controversial and someone actually pays attention, there is possibly the very real threat that you will get punished. And people don't want to deal with it. We've seen this general assault on teachers. Teachers are scared today. They don't want to stick their neck out. The job itself is fascinating in terms of the paradox that's emerged, in terms of how poorly teachers get treated. People call themselves professors in this paradox. I have a PhD, I'm a professor at a four-year school. You also get paid the same salary as a Walgreens assistant manager. By the way, people haven't looked at these numbers, but if you look at the average assistant professor, for example, in the social sciences or political science, it's very common for someone to start at $45,000 to $50,000. I have a good friend of mine in Springfield who is a general manager of Target in town. I told him, did you know that you go to school for 10 to 15 years to get a PhD? And the average starting salary will be between $45,000 to $50,000. And he looked at me mortified. His jaw dropped. And he said, well, are you kidding? That's insane. You know, that's what my assistant managers get paid and other people get paid. Yeah, you can look at these jobs. I've looked at the averages. The data's online. Assistant manager of a Walgreens or a Target or a Home Depot or a Kohl's or a Lowe's. They're making between $50,000 to $60,000 a year. Oftentimes they're making more money than the average starting professor at a community college or a four-year university. Who is getting paid? Who is getting paid in these schools? Administrators are. There's been this huge growth in administrative bloat and salaries. In 1975, there was one administrator for every 84 students. By 2005, it was one for every 68 students. Between 1998 and 2008, college spending on instruction for teachers went up 22%, spending on administration went up 36%. Between the 1940s and the 1980s, administrative costs doubled in universities and colleges. Typical college president today is getting paid between $300,000 and $400,000 a year, whereas the average professor is making around $50,000. It's really quite amazing what's happened. You've turned these occupations into blue-collar occupations, but the problem is these people aren't blue-collar individuals. They're not getting a job as an assistant manager for a retail store out of high school without debt. The typical student I talk to who graduates with a PhD may have between $50,000 to $100,000 in debt. they have foregone 10 to 15 years of income in order to get that degree. And you're going to start them at a salary that pays what somebody should be getting paid out of high school, or is, realistically, without any degree or without any debt, without any college degree. From the 1970s to today, administrative salaries grew 3 times more quickly than faculty salaries. That's the big change that's been happening as of late. And a lot of professors will tolerate it because they get to call themselves a professor, right? They'll leave an adjunct without job security for years and years under the hopes that they'll eventually land a job. Really hoping against hope today because of how few tenure-track jobs there are. If you look today at the number of tenure-track jobs versus non-tenure, if you were to go back, let's say, to the 1970s compared to today, maybe about 1/3 of college professor jobs were non-tenure-track, non-permanent. Today, it's about 1/3 or less that are tenure-track or permanent. It's been a complete 180-degree shift. And why would professors tolerate this? You say you get treated so much poorly today relative to previous decades. Well, part of it's the facade of prestige. You can call yourself a professor and get treated like garbage. And part of it, to be perfectly honest, and this won't win me any awards either, people are gutless. Most of the people I talk to in higher education, it's sort of hard to sympathize after a certain point, because people will tell you to your face, I don't need a union because I'm special. Yes, you do need a union if you're not getting paid well. You need to collectively bargain for higher pay and benefits if you're not being treated properly. And people will say, no, I don't, because I'm the 1 in 100 who's special. I will publish, and I will get promotions, and I'll be the person who gets paid well in this department or moves on, and I'll use this job to leverage into another one. And the reality of the situation is the vast majority of people are not going to be able to do that. So what happens at the middle to end of your career when you realize that this didn't actually happen to you? People just become sorry, pathetic bastards. You've got this massive growth of professors who are just miserable human beings. They're very mad at how badly they've been treated. Well, you could have fought for yourself and unionized, and the vast majority of schools don't have unions. I teach at a college in Springfield, Illinois. We have a union. We negotiate every 3 years, collective bargaining for pay and benefits. Every time, and this happens across the board. People know this who collectively bargain, whether it's in the private workplace or in the public. The lawyer for the administration or for the private workplace comes to you and says, we don't have any money, we can't give you raises. And then people say, no, that's not going to fly. We're not going to agree to not take a pay raise. People sometimes have to go on strike, sometimes they don't. Usually, you compare union workplaces to non-union workplaces for the same kind of job, comparable. People are getting paid much more. In my city, it's very common for the average professor at the community college that I'm at now to get paid $25,000 to $30,000 more than somebody at the school right across the street, which is U of I Springfield. They get paid at a 4-year school, $25,000 to $30,000 less. Same degree, same responsibilities for teaching, or pretty close. And they're getting paid half as much almost. It's incredible, because they don't have a union and they don't organize. So we've got all these wonderful things that have been happening, as you could guess. It's such a great time to be in higher education. Well, the goal here, and this is where I distinguish myself from modern conservatives, is not just to tear it down and sell it off. The goal is to tear it down and fix it. There's a number of things that are going to have to happen, at least 6 things, before we can fix this problem. Number 1, states need to start funding higher education again. If states don't want to do it, the federal government has to step in. And they have to start collecting those tax revenues that states used to, and they need to fund these schools. Until you do that, you're not going to see a return to public education. Number 2, faculty need to unionize. No one's going to fight for you except for yourself. How can you expect an administrator to fight for you if you won't fight for yourself, honestly? Number 3, society in general needs to start demanding that professors produce meaningful research or commentary or whatever. I haven't figured out exactly how we're going to do that yet when you have institutions that don't value socially significant research. But at some point we're going to have to figure it out and we're going to have to do it. States or the federal government needs to impose limits on this radical growth in administrative salaries and the huge growth in administrative support staff at the expense of teachers. They're going to have to step in and do this because the schools have no incentive. The schools are run by administrators that have every incentive in the world to hire more people under them to do their work for them and to get paid more than anyone else, and unsustainably more. There need to be cost constraints, and there need to be limits on the binge construction spending and the massive growth in amenities that was totally unsustainable. Parents are going to have more discretion. They're going to have to exercise more discretion when it comes to not getting ripped off in the pyramid scheme. You're going to have to understand in this day and age that your child can get just as good of an education if they spend their first 2 years in a community college and transfer to a 4-year school. If these schools, and I'm not necessarily talking about private schools here. If you want to go to a private school and pay a premium for tuition, that's your right to do that. But the idea that state universities don't have affordable education anymore, that's the part that, as far as I'm concerned, is really unacceptable. If these schools aren't going to do it, parents have to protect themselves and their children. You can go to community college for your first 2 years and transfer. God forbid a child live at home instead of going to the campus experience of majoring and partying. You could save half of the money by doing that if they lived at home. Now, should people be able to go away and experience college? Yes, if we can afford, if we can fund it affordably, then yes. And if that's not going to happen, then people have to protect themselves. One of the big problems today is parents haven't been willing to do this. There hasn't been a big growth in community college enrollments because the average parent has become convinced, from high school teachers and college administrators and high school guidance counselors and talking to each other, that my delicate flower of a child is too brilliant for community college. No, it's the same classes. It's the same damn classes. There's an Illinois articulation initiative coordinated by the state. You take the class at the community college, it transfers, no questions asked, to the 4-year school participating in the agreement. It's the same damn credits. And if anything, you might get a better teaching experience in a lot of instances at a place where they actually care about teaching, first and foremost. Parents need to do this. If 4-year schools can bring costs back into a line with benefits, then, maybe, well, then the sky's the limit, really. You can do whatever you want to do, but until that happens, it's really a buyer beware situation at this point. One last thing, and this is actually something that has happened, and it's really a positive step forward, but it's probably going to have to go further. In 2007, the Bush administration, and one of the few things that they did well, I'm willing to concede this point, they introduced the idea in legislation of income-based repayment. Students don't, by law anymore, have to pay back the full amount that they borrowed. It's based upon a percentage of their income and what they can afford. Previously, it was 15% of your income. Under the Obama administration, the rules have been changed. So new money that is borrowed is 10%. By law, you can't pay back more than 10% of your income back to student loans, regardless of how much you owe. Essentially what happened here is the federal government stepped in to bail out states. States decided no longer to fund higher education, and the federal government had to come in to take care of it. Otherwise, if they didn't do it, you're talking about another bubble collapse of $1 trillion in student loans, which would have crushed our economy. Maybe it still will, maybe it won't, I don't know. They've really put this Band-Aid on a problem here. Now, you've still got really high repayment rates. To this day, if people are paying 10 to 15% of their income. So at some point, I think we probably need to move towards forgiveness. I think that's what needs to happen. We need to go back to having higher education as a public good. And until that happens, I don't think that this problem is going to get fixed. But those are some of the things I think that need to happen. Some of those things are happening now when you talk about faculty across the country beginning to unionize. Some faculty and campuses have started to do this for the better. Most haven't. The federal government has stepped in to try and control costs. These are some of the positive things that are happening, but we've got a really long way to go before we can really fix some of these problems. So I'm going to leave people with that, and then if we want to have questions and discussion.
Okay, basically we have about 50 minutes, so that should be ample time for us to go through a Q&A session. I want to clarify one point that you made during the course of the presentation. Now, I can't tell you where I read this, but there's so many books that have been written on this topic with regards to
tenure regarding college professors. I have read, I know in more than one place, I'm quite certain of this, that at least as far as the social sciences go, with regards to, and we're talking about, you know, a broad area here, you know, not just, of course, history, but your field, political science, sociology, anthropology, et cetera, et cetera. Somewhere between 70 and 75% of all PhDs in the United States that are in the social science field never get tenure. I don't know if you've seen those numbers or if you can speak to that. Now on another topic, I'm just going to switch up here a little bit. That idea with regards to like a debt jubilee, I think is the only thing that makes sense to me. In other words, debt forgiveness for current university graduates in the United States. Because when you look at the numbers, they are really pretty bleak. And if we take like what you were talking about, like, well, let's say even a job, you know, the typical job, not at the university level, let's say a baccalaureate degree, a tertiary degree, that individual coming out of any school today, okay, we can accept Ivy League, there's a few elite institutions which would fall into this category, but the overwhelming majority of four-year institutions, those students with that degree are probably more looking at like, not your $45,000 or $50,000, at least the young people that I seem to be running into today, but if they even have a full-time job, they're making more like $30,000. Now, if you just do the math, I mean, that money, I'm sure, virtually all of it is needed. It's almost necessary for them to like, earn a living. They're not earning a living. So the idea that they're ever going to be able to pay back this debt, and many of them, of course, have much higher debt than even $30,000, looks to be impossible. So I just wanted, that was all I had to say about that. I wondered if you might want to comment on that.
Sure. Lauren, did you want to add?
Yeah, can I add a couple things to that? One, I guess, I don't know, I think I might.
Why don't you go to the microphone, Lauren?
Unless you go on the microphone.
As we're recording this. This is going to be online on YouTube, hopefully no later than Monday.
I will now lose my job.
Did you want to address that?
Sure, thank you. So what percent don't get tenure? The numbers are sort of hard to figure out, but I've got a general understanding, and I think it matches yours. I've seen recent studies of, you know, different studies track people's placement over time after they graduate. And I don't think it's even half of people who end up with tenure track. Or, well, you know, they measure it in different ways. It's like tenure track or tenure, or in some sort of other position where you're employed as a postdoctoral researcher or visiting professor. This is maybe like half, I think, from the numbers I've seen, if I remember correctly. I haven't seen them in about a year. And then you've got people, okay, other people who get tenure, right, or get a tenure track job. A lot of them get denied, and I don't think it's half that get denied. It's less than that. But when you start adding up people who get denied tenure, who were tenure track, versus people who never got a job, it's probably in the ballpark of what you're saying.
Yeah, I was really actually referencing people getting employment. You know, it's one thing, you know, have the credential, and maybe you're on a contractual basis for something, but as far as in the historic sense of looking at it, you know, which is basically like a lifetime position.
It's hard to know for sure. You just sort of hear things as a professor, and you know, you talk to people who graduated, and a lot of times people just totally abandon academia entirely. So I had a friend who, you know, he had a PhD and he couldn't get a job, and then I find out later, years later, from talking to other people that he's in the military. He had to join the military. So, you know, or people are ending up in retail, or they do something else totally unrelated.
Great job opportunity.
It's very common to see people doing things that are completely unrelated. In terms of the debt forgiveness thing, you were mentioning, well, can people ever pay this back? Well, they can, but under certain limits. Under the current law, if you have 10% repayment, you pay for 20 years and the rest is forgiven. So the federal government eats the cost after that. You've got the 10% you're paying every month of your income, and then the rest gets forgiven. That's if you work in a private sector job. If you work in a public sector job, a nonprofit, you pay the 10 or 15%, depending on how much you borrowed and when, every month, and then after 10 years it's forgiven. So yes, the money will get paid back, but it's going to get paid back through the federal government covering the repayment. I mean, that's my understanding of the current law. So this is a significant improvement. I don't think it, fully addresses the issue, but certainly there are things being done to bring this under some control. There are long-term concerns, but something is being done, fortunately.
I will follow the precedent of my predecessor and not ask questions, but give another lecture. I went to a community college here in Chicago, specializing in mathematics and science, physics particularly. And then with great hopes, I went to an elite university here in Chicago, hoping to take advantage of the skills of the teachers who were working on the atomic bomb, for instance. There were lots of them there. And I found out my first day at that elite university that the professor whom I went to that school to learn from would introduce the graduate student who was going to teach the course while he went to the Institute of Metals and made an extra $20,000 in addition to his teaching salary. Sometime later, and after I had gotten my doctorate in physics, I wanted to teach in high school. And I went to what used to be the Chicago Teachers College, and now I think it's Chicago State University up on the southeast side of Chicago. And I took several courses in teaching at various levels. Teaching science, teaching mathematics, and teaching literature. Literature course was great. The teaching science course was a graduate course for Chicago teachers so that they could get an increase in their salary if they had a certain number of graduate credits. Well, the class was about 35 people. It was divided into two groups, into groups of two. These people had no idea what was going on, but of the pair, one would give the essence of a particular aspect of science, and the other would give a method of teaching that aspect. There was no criticism of either the science or the method of teaching. It was very frustrating. In the graduate teaching mathematics course, the instructor gave the students one sheet of paper printed on both sides with 100 arithmetic questions. And he said by the end of the semester, the student had to have all 100 of the problems answered correctly. And you had to read a book, not a mathematics book, but a book about mathematics. And it was extremely frustrating. The literature course was great.
Thank you for your sharing the experiences. It seemed like there was a couple of things you were sort of hitting on there. You mentioned grad students teaching classes. I'm not against that per se. I think there's a place for it because you obviously need to learn how to teach before you get into the workplace. I think my problem more is with the extreme reliance in higher ed on terminal master's people who aren't in PhD programs, and they're just being used by administrators as a way to not have tenure track lines. And then you can pay people per class with almost like a slave labor kind of thing. So, we need to have more grad students teaching so they can learn how to actually know how to do their job when they get hired somewhere. But it's the other part that's the real big problem. It seemed like you were sort of making some other points too about lack of critical thought in higher education, whether there's practical value in how classes are being taught. I mean, I would share those concerns. I mean, those are big things that I've been talking about here, and I wouldn't disagree with any of the things that you've been sharing.
Mark? I think I might be the only full professor actively teaching at the moment in this building, but I don't have any quarrel with anything you've said. I think one point though you're a little bit exaggerated.
Closer to the microphone.
I think one point that you mentioned, is this working?
Yeah.
Just step up.
Okay.
Just step up to it.
Gotta get, yeah, that right. There you go.
There you go.
Okay. I was very surprised many years ago when I found out that somewhere in the vicinity of 3/4 of the faculty are not tenured, and not on tenure track, and are making less than you're talking about. There was an interesting little blurb on Alternet, which is sort of a left progressive site, basically saying that the future of higher education in this country, that increasingly students will be taught by children of the elite whose parents can afford to subsidize their lifestyle, because faculty are making less and less and less and less. On the income figures you were giving, I think one of the figures that I like to use in my globalization class is some of the best and the brightest of the undergraduates are the little, the bright, bushy-tailed guys and gals that go off to work for Apple. Just as an aside, as a footnote, Apple has the highest profit per shelf space in the United States, gross of $7,000 a year per square foot of shelf space. That's twice the next closest competitor, which is Walmart. In other words, for each square foot, the Apple people that start there get about $10, $15 an hour. If they work hard enough, they can come to $20 an hour. You can kind of figure that out. I'm a little more pessimistic about the income figures that you're talking about, but I think that there's a question that I don't think you can answer, because I can't answer it simply myself, but it needs to be borne in mind. What's the purpose of education? And I think that this is the question that's in the background. This is the 800 or 900 or 2,000 pound gorilla. I'm probably, given my age and all of that, one of those ancient relics, although around here I'm not exactly the mature one. I might be, that's besides the point. I came from a poor family. Nobody in my family had gone to college. I didn't know anything about what college was all about. And I just found it so illuminating, when I used to, as a freshman and a sophomore, hanging around with people that talk with big words and all that kind of stuff. But I figured, gee whiz, how'd they ever get to be so smart? And I figured if I hang around for long enough, I could talk. I never got smart, but I could use big words and things like that. But increasingly, in the background, what we're seeing is that college is increasingly job training and preparation of the social values of obedience and conformity that used to be the requirements of whatever. And so, to me, part and parcel of why college is valuable is not simply job training, but an exposure to Western culture, non-Western culture, to the things that you learn in art, literature, other than marketing bullshit that I teach at Loyola, as most of the people here know, and we're a big business school and all that kind of stuff. Loyola's in the process of going through change. One of the things that I always valued about it, being a Jesuit university, is that they put a great stress on philosophy, on classics. Classics, how do you make any money teaching, Ovid or Euripides, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that this is this is something that has to be looked at in terms of why bother with education, when increasingly it's job training and profitability. You could have said a little bit more. You raised it, but the tremendous growth of the for-profit schools, like University of Phoenix, and there was just an article, I think it was in the New York Times over the weekend, on the scam of these for-profit law schools that take very, very unqualified people because they get government loan, and then there's no jobs anyhow. For whatever the reasons, the law has almost ended as a profession because most of the work is now being done by paralegals, because it just basically gets stuff out of the whatever. Last but not least, or this is sort of a two-part question. Number one, when you talk about the lack of criticism, well, as you know, I guess some of the people know here, I come from a particular intellectual tradition, Frankfurt School, and one of the main points of the Frankfurt School, which is not an original point, is I use Marcuse, who put it nicely, one-dimensional thought. We do not teach critical thought in higher education. We do not teach critique, because the point that you made, you basically say that we have a government, of the rich, for the rich, and by the rich, and we have two sets of whores called Democrats and Republicans that are both fucking the people over. I can't use that language in class, but I get a lot of...
Go ahead here.
What?
Go ahead here.
I can do it here. I will make these statements in class. A few students will object, and some of them will say, hey, that's right. What's that guy, Obama came to end war. He's now, what, third Bush administration or something like that. But you point, you point this out to people. And you don't get a lot of brownie, but I happen to because, I'm nice and have a good sense of humor, and I can joke around and things like that. But it does take a certain degree of balls to really come out and be overtly critical. I'm at the point where, if they want to fire me, fine. I'm getting tired of putting up with undergraduates who don't want to listen to anything, et cetera, et cetera. Anyhow, I basically, as you know, I pretty much very, very much agree with you. But I think that this important thing is a much larger cultural change in which the value of education, of learning about art, poetry, literature, and I think that's a great thing of being able to teach literature and some of the science books. I think that this is something that's important. And as I mentioned to you before it started, this guy John Homewood, he's an English sociologist, has been talking about this as a universal problem, part and parcel of neoliberalism. So it's not time for unionization, it's time for a socialist party.
Comment, response, or another question?
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, you mentioned, it sounds like you have a pretty good understanding of, what our goal should be. You mentioned that's the big question. As far as I can tell, I agree with what you said, but I would add, there's the three things maybe. Learning how to think, because so many people don't know how to do that, unfortunately. If you teach people just, basic tasks, they don't know how to think critically. And not even just how to think critically, how to think in general. How do you make an argument? How do you present evidence? People don't know how to do that. I had a student recently, a nice student, but I asked them, what would you recommend that we do next time in this class, next semester, for the next students? And she said, we should have more quizzes. I said, you want to do more work? I'm impressed. Well, no, that's not what she meant. She meant, I said, so I could have quizzes on the readings, because I'm not very thrilled with it. The job you all did, they didn't do a very good job on the readings. I said, so I'll have quizzes on the readings. That's a really good idea. And she started shaking her head. I said, what's the problem? No, I meant more like, you would lecture in class and we'd write it down and then we'd have a quiz on what we covered in class. So in other words, like you tell me what to think and then I, go write it on Blackboard, the electronic, school or learning website, and I type it in and I get the points. It's like, you mean a test? We have those. We have tests, midterm and final. You want more of those? Just typing it on from your sheet to the computer? I said, yeah. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. You have a quiz on your reading. I'm not going to just have you type crap down. So people need to learn how to think. How do you participate in a democratic society? That's what I was always most interested in as an undergraduate. How do I learn how to be an active citizen to make things in my country better? Now maybe that made me weird compared to everybody else who thought their major was keg stands.
Very weird.
And getting a job. I just sort of assumed that was going to happen later. I would have enough skills to get a job at some point, and I'd figure it out later. But I'm here to do things and be idealistic. And, part of this also relates to what you talked about with culture, right? Learning about the world, cosmopolitan, being cultured, humanities, classics. Too many people in the social sciences have a total contempt for theory and ideas and culture. It's really pathetic, but it's unfortunately a reality when you train these people to be automatons. They're fake people. It's not going to win me any awards either, calling other faculty that, but it's true. The for-profit thing you mentioned, well, that's just corporate socialism, right? You've got the government handing out massive amounts of money, guaranteed money in student loans to these predatory institutions that don't offer quality degrees, and employers know it. They're diploma mills. That's a problem overall, but especially at for-profit schools. So they just need to cut the source off at the base there. I mean, that's what needs to happen. These schools need to go away. There's no reason for them to exist. There's no reason to be making money off of predatory education. So I agree with that too.
Well, we're going to get worse commercials on TV though. Like, what kind of commercials will we have if there's no more for-profit university commercials?
There'll always be other bad commercials, of course.
I shudder to think.
Mute.
Question?
I just want, you brought up about people not teaching, not emphasizing teachers. And it was about 30 years ago that I was in engineering school, and we had, I was in like my third major calculus class, multivariate calculus, something like that. And our teacher was gone, our regular teacher was gone. So we had another guy that came in and said, I'm almost at the end of my career here, another year or so and I'm out of here. He said, what I'm going to do for you today is I'm going to do a derivation of something or solve some problem. I can't remember, it's 30 years ago, I don't remember exactly what he did. But he went through and he did it in such rapid fire, it was totally intelligible. You could follow step by step. It was almost like listening to a concert, because the people who were following it, when the class was over, he got a standing ovation. I never saw that once before or since. And not everybody stood, because there are a lot of people just like, I don't get it, and they weren't following it. But there were people that were actually interested in what he was teaching, and he was interested in what he was teaching, and the people were actually so enthused. It was just it was kind of a great experience. And he said, he was leaving because people don't value teachers, and he's been doing this and working with the students for all of his career. And he says people that are doing other things, working in research, whatever, are just, they're the ones that get recognition, and I'm like, never really attained that status in my department, you know. But it was just one of those things that kind of, I remember it like being there, you know. Another engineering professor was doing, talking and saying they treat us like day laborers here. You'd think that in basically 1985 and 86 with the big tech boom, that there'd be some values, as everything we do is property of the university. We can't even do anything without quitting the school and publishing on our own in order to put any of our work and actually get any recognition or value for it, because it belongs to the department, you know. Final thing, and you complained about the process, where you're doing statistics and you're doing measuring things that have no end. I recall there was a Chrysler received an award for a process. And this is sort of like something bleeding in from academia into manufacturing. It was called the Malcolm Baldrige Award. It was for the process, not for the product, but for the process. So they got this great award for the process of designing a transmission for the Dodge Caravan, Chrysler, I don't know, it was a different name. But the problem is that thing had a big recall, because it would just quit. This transmission stopped working. You had to pull over to the side of the road and wait for like 2 minutes, so the pressure would drop down the transmission. You could restart the car and drive away. And it just seems so funny to me that here's the engine that can't even drive on a highway, and it's got this big Malcolm Baldrige Award for process, but there's no output. So it's not limited to academia.
Yeah,
So,
that's a good point.
Yeah.
You brought up a lot of good points. On the point of departments taking advantage of professors, I mean, that really does happen across the board. People aren't compensated for the research part. I mean, you do the teaching and the research is considered to be part of your meager salary. What departments could do is, you know, compensate professors for doing meaningful outreach, whether it be interviews with the media or writing columns or hosting some sort of public forum with the community, or research that actually has a practical value. I think that does need to be a part of the system, because people aren't getting compensated for all this massive amount of work. The average professor today, I've seen numbers saying that they spend 50 hours a week working, and you know, they're not getting compensated for it. So departments need to do a better job of that. You also mentioned, the general idea I got from you was, you know, what a big difference good teaching can make if you just have that one really good teacher, right? It would make a difference. Because people do know, actually. Maybe they never see it, but sometimes you do see it. Every once in a while you do see that one teacher, and then that's when the light goes on and you realize, look at all this crap I've been listening to for 10 years. Oh my God, this is what a good teacher would look like? And usually each student has that experience at least a couple times. So yeah, I mean, it is out there. People know, they can recognize it. The difference between somebody who's good and somebody who doesn't care or is clueless. So we need to do a better job of rewarding those people.
Apologize, I came late, so if you covered it, just do this and I'll walk back. First of all, yeah, in some communities there is a value in teaching and community reach, but in general universities are not compensated, are not evaluated by each other, by the system of higher education for those kind of activities. Instead is, you know, publishing and awards. So that's a system issue. Now in Western Europe, just to put the whole American higher education in perspective. Western Europe has some advantages on us, and that is, one, the culture of scholarity, what Lauren was talking about, not just learning how to do a job, but in general, just education, is much higher. People, it's just in the culture itself. Secondly, they have all those safety nets. So university professors, faculty, doesn't have to be slaves. They do not depend on a system for their benefits. They have their security. They have their benefits. As citizens of that society, it frees them. It also increases academic freedom and freedom in general. So that's the second thing. And another is that it's free tuition too, because higher education in Western Europe, again, most of the countries in Western Europe, is either completely free or not, but is not regarded as for profit. It is not something you buy, it is something you deserve as a citizen. It is part of your human rights. And it is so screwed up here where higher education, well, I think that one of the reasons that I attribute it, maybe I'm paranoid, but it looks to me like the ruling class wants to withhold education, wants to withhold information as a way of controlling and keeping people where they are.
I think you made a lot of really good points. Starting with the last one, the ruling class thing, sometimes people try to frame that in terms of dismissing that point as a conspiratorial thing, but I think it's out in the open. If you look at surveys of political leaders, they don't think that they need to be accountable to the average citizen and their attitudes, so they envision citizens as actually not wise or intelligent enough to influence politics, and they say this in surveys. And really the whole point of modern consumerism is creating passive buyers, right? I mean, these are built into the agendas of the government and private institutions. So I agree totally with that. You had mentioned some other points about, in Western Europe, employees getting treated far better, and there being a culture of caring more about learning and free tuition. And I think that we could solve a lot of these problems by changing American culture in general. If people care a lot more and pay more attention and are more vigilant, well, for example, if employees are, if faculty are fighting for themselves, and people are more engaged and they understand the importance of being engaged, if that culture is there to care about participating, then a lot of the injustice will get addressed. We'd probably be able to do a better job of funding higher education. I think that's really the broadest level where this is really important when you talk about that cultural change. As far as I'm concerned, when that happened, when you changed the value of a degree from general education and thinking and being a productive citizen toward just a job, that was when everything else really started falling apart. Once that whole thing was instrumentalized, that was really the root of the problem. So if we can fix that, I think a lot of the other stuff will start to fall into place.
Hi, thank you very much. The infection of capitalism is going on for a long time. A Spanish philosopher, Ortega y Gasset, about 100 years ago said, education is leading to barbarism. He was a poet, a writer, a very, very intelligent person. And the reason he said that was that he saw that education was becoming utilitarian. That means you were training people to become cogs of an industrial process. And that was not, according to him, the purpose of education, to serve society. And so, like I say, close to 100 years ago, somebody had the vision to see where we were going. And we have arrived. This is unsustainable anymore. And I think the whole system is so corrupted, so disruptive for the life-sustaining forces of the earth and everything, that it have to be changed. And I don't know how, but maybe you will help us to determine that.
My goal is to help one student at a time to make people actually care. And I think, when we talk about the culture of caring and learning, we can get rid of a lot of this whole education as utilitarian by teaching people to care about thinking and care about what's happening in the world. Now, that's not beaten out of students entirely by the time they get to my classes. It is largely beaten out of them, but it's interesting to see people sort of rediscover their love of learning and thinking. Not every student does it. Unfortunately, for every student that does, there's another student that I see that they really just don't get it because it's been beaten into their mind throughout K through 12 that learning is about doing well on a test and on a standardized memorization, right? So for some people, unfortunately, their parents could have helped them get past that at some point. That didn't happen. The educational system didn't do it. You can only do so much as an individual teacher, but if enough teachers do that, then it could change. And especially you mentioned life on Earth. I mean, climate change. People really have these reverse priorities. People care about getting a job and having fun in life and entertainment, and all those things are nice. But what good is all that if the planet is being ruined? So if people really get their priorities inverted, it's just one of those things where there's a whole generation of people coming up, and they've been socialized to not understand that there's a world around them they have to care about. So it is something that we're going to have to change. Maybe a lot of it will be necessity. As the Earth starts to decline and ecosystems are declining, people are going to have to pay attention. And hopefully we can do something before it's too late. We'll see what happens.
We will not be here.
Yeah.
But I mean, there is an optimism.
So,
Speak right into it.
All right, so my whole thing is that I think that the public educational system has really been abandoned, certainly here in the city of Chicago. First, well, a lot of things have happened here in the city, but it's been common to what's happened in a lot of big cities, where first you have segregation in the neighborhoods, and therefore you have segregation in the neighborhood schools. Chicago instituted the system of magnet schools so they didn't have to bus kids in general from one neighborhood to the other. And this whole system is really disturbing, but the other things that have been happening, and so I can only address what's happened in the past 15 years or so that I've been involved with primary education, that as a parent, basically, and as a community member, that funds have been cut to the schools, teachers have been cut. Here in Chicago, Emmanuel closed 50 schools, and a couple of years before, Richard II closed, 20 schools or something, and No Child Left Behind, which was parodied as No Millionaire Left Behind, closed some other schools because of lack of quote-unquote qualifications of the students or accomplishments of the students. And what we've really done is we've cut funding to neighborhood schools, to basic neighborhood schools, and then we told the neighborhood schools they weren't meeting their goals, and because they couldn't have the reading teachers, they couldn't have the science teachers or the science facilities. We changed Senn High School into a military school, and they took over the building that had the labs in it. So the rest of the school, who weren't in the military school, didn't have any science labs for a few years until they were able to build on new more. So there was a whole set of students who lost all of those experiences. They've been jacking around with the school day. They've been, many campuses are closed, and primary school campuses are closed, which means they don't have a playground, which means that they don't have a recess. And when you look at all the studies that correlate physical activity with academic achievement, and we don't have kids with that aspect, that the art teachers and the music teachers have been cut from almost all the schools. Before he closed 50 schools, there were 150 Chicago public schools who didn't have libraries And that included, I don't know, 25 or 30 high schools that did not have a school library. I mean, I went to a Catholic school, and they had a library. I mean, please, I mean, I don't know about the quality of the books in there, but they had a library. And, you know, what, you have to look and say, what are you thinking? And people don't have the idea anymore that education, and you know, you can't, you have these kids that have been turned off to learning because they were turned off in primary school, a lot of them. And if they didn't get turned off in primary school, they were turned off in high school. And in my mind, that's where a lot of our resources need to go, is in the primary and secondary school systems here, because we're not going to have, we have a college, because of the quality of our primary and secondary school education here. College is the equivalent of high school in European educational systems. People don't come here from Europe to go to high school. They come here to go to graduate school. They don't come here to go to baccalaureate programs, because that's what they already studied in high school. So, you know, all of this is something that as a society, I think we need to come back to the idea that education is really like a sacred responsibility of a society towards its children and its families. And, you know, it's something that people look at you like you're out of your mind, or you're a lefty tree hugger or something when you come up with those ideas, or you're this ideological bleeding heart liberal or something. And, you know, excuse me, you know, we have, these people are going to be taking care of us when we're in nursing homes. So we really need to have them be thinking about what's happening. And we really need to focus on our, in my mind, one of the places that we really need to put a lot of, although I realize that you're on college stuff now, but I really think we need to put a lot of our focus onto our primary and secondary school systems.
Right, I mean, that's a good point. We need to deal with these issues when they start becoming an issue, rather than just sort of dealing with them later when it's almost too late. You made a lot of really good points. I was thinking about, you know, the rise of non-union charter schools, school closures, budget cuts. I live in Springfield, so I observe state of Illinois congressional committee or legislative committee meetings in the House and Senate, and it's like disturbing to see story after story of, you know, on the state level, funds just being, you know, the state being systematically behind in terms of underfunding everything. Schools that don't have gyms, they don't have gym teachers, they don't have enough money to, you know, repair buildings to learn in, and, you know, these things are all really disturbing. I was thinking also about a point you mentioned about segregation. You know, Springfield has its fair share of segregation, like anywhere else. All cities do. But I'd been away from Chicago for a few years, and I hadn't lived here in a while, so sometimes you get romantic ideas in your head. And you come back, and I was in Lincoln Park, sort of walking around a little bit before this, and it started just pissing me off. So I said, you know what? I haven't seen a single black person or Hispanic person. I was like, they're here. They got to be somewhere here. It's like, oh yeah, you go into like the Taco Bell or the McDonald's. They're, you know, they're working there as like a, you know, they're working on the line or ringing you up. I saw a Latina girl and an African American guy. Those are the only people I saw in all of Lincoln Park who weren't whites. You'd say, I was sort of, you know, reflecting, sitting there and looking at some of these families. They're all white families, and mother, father, child, and I thought, you know, it's just really sad, because I think about all these kids, and they go to these schools that maybe they're going to a well-funded private school, or, you know, they've got resources in their family, and I bet you most of these kids are going to turn out pretty good. You know, they've got parents who are watching out for them, and they go to a school that functions relatively well, although I'm sure most every school could be doing better. And I came up with thinking, you know, and what happens to the rest of the people in the city of Chicago or in Springfield or anywhere else? And it's like, well, you know, you probably wouldn't be thinking that even if you didn't have the critical education and, you know, thinking about all these things and knowledge of segregation and how money and instructional spending and community wealth influences student performance and all these things that matter so much. Some other person might just be sitting there thinking, I like this taco. Well, you know, people miss things around them very easily if they're not learning to think critically, and they don't have the resources to do it. So, I mean, these things are all around us. But, you know, we've got to do a much better job.
Here I am again. Your comments about the really good teacher who makes a big difference. I had one of those, fortunately, in the community college. She was a 90-year-old German immigrant, and she used to bounce around the room talking about mathematics. It was really inspiring. She didn't have the pronunciation exactly. She called trajectories trajectories and peripheries peripheries. But nonetheless, it was inspiring.
But you remember that.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Now, in my misspent youth, I worked for the precursor of NASA, and was working there when Russia put up Sputnik. And it scared the hell out of everybody at Redstone Arsenal. And there was a great clamor among the politicians and others about the big missile gap and the education gap. So what they did in the South, this is in Huntsville, Alabama, they recruited high school science teachers from all over the South who were making about $200 a month teaching high school, and offered them positions at Redstone Arsenal and some of the other research facilities at $700 a month. They jumped at it, they ran. The result was that there was no science education in the South for 10 years. It was a real crime, real crime.
But we beat the Rusties.
No, we didn't.
No, we didn't. Oops, oops.
Also, as Margaret mentioned, our undergraduate schools are not very good. The Europeans will not send their children to the United States, or the Asian children. Parents will not send their children here for undergraduate education, but they will send them for graduate education, because our graduate schools are much better than the graduate schools in Japan, China, or Europe.
Why is that?
Because the people who are teaching graduate courses at the highest level are dealing with the subjects that the students want to learn about, and there's a good interchange.
The interchange, I think, is probably key. That's the big difference between a lot of undergraduate classes. If you've got like a huge lecture hall or something, people are just being taught at. Whereas with a graduate program, you're trying to train people to be active thinkers, to teach stuff later and do research. So there's more value put on creative thought. There are still problems, of course, too. You know, a lot of times, this idea that there's some sort of practical value coming out of the research, that's something that a lot of graduate programs, from what I've seen, don't do a very good job stressing. But in general, the interactive part is there. So that's the big strength, I think.
But if you put emphasis on the practical uses of the research, you are defeating the purpose of opening up new frontiers. You don't know what will come out of any of that. But if you,
People will come up with their own
base
ideas.
it on a profitable idea, then that's what happens.
So
Right.
you're saying there should be a practical objective to research, or it should be pure research?
I think it needs to be active and practical. I think that these teachers need to be, these professors need to be telling people, you know, why is it you're here and what are you going to contribute to our society? We don't produce knowledge for its own sake. It has to have some sort of purpose.
This will be the last question or comment.
Tony, I want to point out something which I think is a lot of the kind of conservative rhetoric, or rhetoric where conservatives would agree with you on a lot of things that you're saying. And I wrote down a few examples of one is referring to higher education as a Ponzi scheme, calling for cuts in administrative spending, trying to get rid of the emphasis on research, especially within the humanities and social sciences, having parents tell their children where to go to college, and having students living at home, fighting against grade inflation. These are all things that I would agree with some of them, actually, but a lot of conservatives would push for this kind of thing. And I'm wondering, why haven't conservatives been able to do that if there are things that a lot of people on the left agree with, and this is part of a conservative agenda? What is getting in the way of, what is stopping conservatives really from running higher education? And are there places where the left and the right should fight against kind of the corporate middle on these issues?
Well, I guess it depends on what conservatives you're talking about, because I regularly interact with conservative students who haven't been indoctrinated and poisoned by Fox News and Rush Limbaugh. And they're actually quite thoughtful individuals, and they might have conservative ideas about hard work and this and that, and some of the other stuff you talked about. And I think there is a lot of room to work with those people, because, you know, I get great evaluations from liberal and conservative students because they haven't been perverted in their thought with what I would call the false populism. And I think that's what that's what I think of when I hear you saying, you know, there's these similarities between the rhetoric. The difference is that when I look at a lot of the conservative rhetoric coming from political leaders and business people, it's a fake populism. It's like, oh, look at all this outrage, and, well, what do you really want to do? You want to kill it and sell it off. Get rid of it. We don't need community colleges and all this other stuff. You can have the for-profits because they make money and they can prey on people. And then you can have the elite schools, and maybe to the extent you have any other schools, maybe the people there just will get ripped off and whatever. Sell it all off. And I'm calling for a real populism. So I think that, you know, this is very common. You see this in a lot of conservative rhetoric from political leaders. They say things that sound nice, but it's not really what they mean. How many times have you heard conservatives in the Obama era say patriotism is defined by being critical, except for if George Bush is president, then you can go to hell, right? If you criticize, then you're un-American and you need to be thrown in prison or stigmatized. So that's what I would take conservative political leaders to task for. It's a fake rhetoric. You know, it sounds nice and people buy into it. You hear the Bruce Rauner, he wants to ride in on a white horse and save everyone. He's coming to gut the state. I mean, he's complaining about teachers and education. He's here to kill it, not to save it.
On that cogent note, that's got to be the last comment. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you.